Welcome to Let's Get Critical, a new series of short lectures that highlight interdisciplinary research, connect art and artistic practice to a variety of fields of study, and invite opportunities for discussion and conversation. Tonight we will hear from Jean Ketterling and Kyle McPhail, two fantastic scholars whose research on video games explores feminism, autism, sexual discovery, and queer and transgender representation. Each scholar will make a short presentation, followed by a kind of question period, discussion period. At the end of the evening, there will be a selection of games for folks to play. Tonight's program was put together by the amazing and wonderful Rachel Thornton, curator of digital engagement, and I want to thank Rachel for her amazing work. I also want to let you know that she's helping us develop, there will be a selection of games for folks to play. Tonight's program was put together by the amazing and wonderful Rachel Thornton, curator of digital engagement, and I want to thank Rachel for her amazing work. I also want to let you know that she's helping us develop an exhibition on video games and art for 2026 in the fall. And before I introduce Kyle and Jean, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge some funders. So Heather and Ian Bourne, we thank them for funding Kyle's Colville Fellowship. And it's been amazing working with Kyle for the last 2 years. And as always, the Owens is funded by Mount Allison University, the Canada Council for the Arts, the New Brunswick Department of Tourism, Heritage and Culture, and the town of Tantramar. So as I do not want to interrupt the flow of the presentations, I'm going to introduce both Jean and Kyle, although Jean will speak first and Kyle will speak second. So Jean Ketterling is a PhD candidate in the legal studies. Oh no. Yes, you are. Sorry. I'm like, Carleton? No. Is a PhD candidate in legal studies at Carleton University and a lecturer in women's and gender studies at Mount Allison University. Her research on sex and video games is rooted in feminist and queer theories and legal, game, and pornography studies. Most recently, her work has appeared in feminist media studies. I know. Just remember that it's doing its best. And the edited collection, Law, Video Games, Virtual Realities Playing Law, which came out this year in 2024. Kyle McPhail is the Colville House Fellow at the Pierre Lassonde School of Fine Arts at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. They have a PhD in Museum Studies from the University of, Leicester, where they focused on how mainstream art museums represent gender and sexuality. Their current research addresses transgender and disability representation and perception in art and visual culture, specifically looking at fandom, spaces, video games, and digital art. So thank you both. I'm looking forward to this.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. We could also talk about the governance of sex through technology and AI, the erasure of pornography, at some point in the Q&A if you want to. Yeah, this is going to be a lot of that today, it seems like. Alrighty, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you folks tonight. I've only been here for the semester, but it's really been serendipitous and wonderful to get to meet Kyle and to work with classes for a couple times at the Owens as well. It's been really exciting and fun. So I'm going to jump right into it. There are no monsters. There is no death. Only you, the 1990s internet, and the fear of being caught. This is the pitch for You Must Be 18 or Older to Enter, a video game about the first sweaty palm time you search the internet for pornography on your family's computer. How Do You Do It plays with similar ideas. It puts you in the place of an 11-year-old girl who takes advantage of this short window of time while her mother runs an errand out of the house to explore her questions about sex through play. So these two video games really captured my imagination when I first played them. Certainly, part of their stickiness for me was the way they allowed me to replay aspects of my own 1990s childhood, but also I felt that these two video games together reveal something really interesting about sex, playfulness, and the possibility of loosening, however temporarily, the normative strictures of what we'll call straight time, and I'll talk about that more. So today my focus is on what these video games can tell us about how this thing we normally think of as constraining, surveillance, shapes sexual horizons of possibilities in many, often contradictory ways. In other words, I ask, what do these two video games that use sex and surveillance playfully to fuel the affective intensity of play tell us about how surveillance interfaces more broadly with sexual pleasure and politics? Or in other words, what do these games make possible for players, and what do they do in the world? So I'm going to suggest that they do three things tonight, although I would suggest they actually do innumerable things, or they have the possibility to do innumerable things. So first, I'm going to argue that the video games use the threat of surveillance to amplify sexual affect and pleasure in a way that can be conceptualized following David Bell as flirting with surveillance. Second, I'll argue that the nostalgia of playing these games can sometimes lead players to exceptionalize themselves and their own sexual experiences and contribute to greater calls for surveillance for today's current young people. Similarly, the mechanics of you must be 18 or older to enter belie some adult attitudes towards pornography. And then finally, third, drawing on Catherine Bond-Stockton and Jose Esteban Munoz, I'm going to argue that these two video games allow players to become a playful child, to loop back through time and re-explore sexual discovery. I see these games as animated by a desire to re-become a playful child. This is a figure, I will argue, that allows adults to imagine new futures, new sexual futures, and disrupt hegemonic conceptualizations of proper sexual maturity. But before I get into that, we should talk about the idea of the figure of the child and its relationship to the fleshy, the real child, right? So when we talk about the child, I'm often following Edelman and Edelman's conceptualization of the child as a figure that provokes a lot of anxiety, provokes or shapes us in certain ways and has a huge amount of political, cultural power. But I also think in the context of these games, but also our current socio-legal landscape, we have to think about children and adolescents as being subject to surveillance, discipline, and control of their fledgling sex lives, and that is shaped by a variety of social, legal, and cultural forces. As Broom and Hurley write, the hegemonic precept of dominant Anglophone Western culture is that children and adolescents are and should stay innocent of sexual desires and intentions. And this shapes how adults conceptualize children and the types of control we enact over them at all stages of their life. So, we could, again, in the Q&A, we could talk about the way this has shaped things like the recent proposal for age verification for pornography websites, for example, the way this figure, right, really animates certain calls for increased surveillance, governance, etc. But there is also real children at stake here. So there's sort of two things that are happening there. But I'm also in this context of today talking about adults inhabiting that figure, right? So particularly important for me when we consider how adults might experience replaying childhood sexual exploration is understanding that acknowledging childhood sexual exploration can cause adults considerable discomfort, if not provoking sort of outright hysteria at times. As such, I think these games, while they're not particularly graphic, they're not particularly pornographic if we were to think about our normative definitions of pornography, but they're still they risk being unsettling for adults because they disrupt what Kincaid sees as adults' tendencies to enact a sort of performative frenzy wherein they become hysterical and write a kind of pious pornography, his words, not mine, through which they can express concern, create scapegoats, and revel in, quote, lavish public spectacles that construct children as constantly under threat of sexual abuse or contamination. And those are some of the things that these games, I think, are playing with. In You Must Be 18 or Older to Enter, players embody a young person taking advantage of a moment when their parents are out of the house to explore online pornography for the first time. The game is visually sparse. The video games rely on sound to produce affective intensity and sexual thrill. The developers describe this game as a horror game. So the sounds sort of are of your quiet house and creaking and sounds behind you. And so you're trying to evade your parents' disciplinary gaze, and a door will creak behind you, and you will have to sort of click the look behind me button to make sure your parents haven't caught you in this shameful act. So keywords appear on the screen indicating that we can start our search within with porn, people doing it, sex, and fourth base, and then navigating to websites with names like xxxxxx.com or porntub.com and clicking on those options. As we click on those options, images will slowly load in the style that they are ASCII images, and if you were around on the early internet, the sort of way that ASCII images would load slowly. Some people are nodding. They were giving our age away. And so these stylized images will appear, and they're of pixelated, almost unrecognizable sex acts. So while you as a player are anxiously trying to explore, the images are also forcibly sort of slowing you down and increasing that tension. So then if a door creaks, you jump, and when I play this, screamed a lot because it was like viscerally terrifying, and you click the look behind you button to see if your parents have caught you. So how do you do it plays with similar ideas. This was a game made quickly in a game jam context by 3 people. The lead sort of, we could say, developer, Nina Freeman, is a well-known feminist game developer. Bo Ruberg identifies them as sort of part of the queer games avant-garde. Their games have gotten quite a lot of attention in that space. So the video game begins when your mother leaves the house, and you, playing as this young white girl with yellow blonde hair and blue eyes, again, the idealized symbol of the figure of the child, right? The child deserving of sort of care and attention and surveillance and governance. She leaves the house, and you, as this girl, pick up your Barbie dolls to figure out, how do you do it? Her play is motivated by Titanic, which again, if maybe you were 11 when Titanic came out, you too understand. And I really identify with it. I was about that age when Titanic came out, and I was scandalized by Titanic and was very confused about why a person could be naked on a movie. It was very shocking to me, my little Puritan heart. And it was certainly this very nostalgic moment for me in playing this game. So you use the keyboard keys to move the 2 naked dolls up, down, side to side, and the fun comes in slamming their smooth plastic bodies together to make pleasing click, click, click noises. Absorbed in your experimentation, you might not hear gravel crunching under tires. The video game ends abruptly as your scandalized mother arrives home and catches you at play. If you are more attentive than me, you can pull the dolls apart, hide them behind your back when you hear the car, and the game will end with the image of the girl blushing and holding the dolls behind her back as her quizzical mother re-enters the house. So I want to talk now about these 3 ways we might think about what these games are doing with surveillance. So first, they're using surveillance as a way to amplify sexual affect. So in his study of how pornography viewers reconcile their nostalgic memories with current anti-porn discursive fervor, Taylor explains how prohibition and surveillance can amplify sexual intensity. He quotes a participant from one of his studies. These are people he was interviewing about their memories of seeking out pornography as young people. And he quotes a participant who recounts how bypassing the porn blockers installed on his family computer produced intense and thrilling affect. The participant says, "There was this massive thrill for us in that not only looking at porn, which we'd never seen before, but also figuring out ways to access it and, accessing something that's not meant to be that's meant to be inaccessible. And it's meant to be wrong, and we're not meant to look at it. So it came with this kind of thrill." In other words, the censorship and inaccessibility of pornography can amplify its titillating potential. Similarly, How Do You Do It? And You Must Be 18 or Older to Enter mobilize the threat of surveillance to amplify sexual affect. We, playing these games, are adults. We can go find pornography if we want. But the sexual tension, the sexual affect that these games produce is motivated by that disciplinary figure of the parent, who serves in some ways as a metaphor as well. So they repurpose, they mobilize this threat of surveillance, repurposing the embodied experience of being subject to surveillance for new pleasurable ends. So, for example, in How Do You Do It, the gleeful liberty of experimentation would not be possible in the same way without this looming threat of the mother in the house or returning home. Concern with being caught is what motivates your play in the first place. The game, I don't think, would be particularly fun or interesting without that figure there. So following David Bell, we might conceptualize this knowing deployment of surveillance as a kind of flirting with surveillance. So in response to another scholar who argued that no one flirts with surveillance cameras, David Bell thinks through this idea of flirting with surveillance. So he is researching pornography with surveillance aesthetics, including camming and other, quote, reality porn. And he argues that people, quote, flirt, tease, strip, and in countless other ways act sexually while other people watch in context structured by the logics and aesthetics of surveillance. And that eroticization of that surveillance can be a mode of resistance, a way of hijacking the dominant uses of surveillance. I think this is part of what's going on in these games. So I think they're similar in the sense that the pleasure and the fun that you as a player derive from the surveillance might be understood as a form of resistance, a way of taking back control over images and their uses. And the mechanization of surveillance in both video games might thus be conceptualized as an example of subverting or resisting the normative role of surveillance in video games, in young people's lives, but also in our own lives and the way we then enact surveillance in other people's lives, as well as digital surveillance, right? So the mother as a metaphor for the many kinds of surveillance and governance we face in our everyday lives, especially online. Okay, so then the second piece I want to talk through is the way in which some players orient themselves thinking or exceptionalize the games and re-entrench some of these existing power dynamics. So while flirting with surveillance might be understood as a practice of resistance, there are other, more normative ways, I think, that games might frame youthful sexual exploration. Okay, so first, both games rely really heavily, for a subset of players, me included, on nostalgia. While nostalgia has interesting world-making possibilities, it can also be used to exceptionalize the past and justify increased discipline in the future, especially in relation to porn. So Taylor, again, returning to Taylor, who draws on Susanna Passanen's work on nostalgia, argues that there is a curiously selective historicity around pornography driven by nostalgia. So adults look back at how they used or encountered pornography as teenagers and generally understand it as a relatively harmless experience of exploration and experimentation. However, the way that they afford themselves agency in their childhood memory often stands in pretty stark contrast to their unwillingness to grant other pornography viewers, particularly young people, the same type of agency. So this is described as a third-person effect, but it's sort of this dynamic. So you must be 18 or older to enter mechanics. So that's an audience question, right? Which I'm not fully, this wasn't an audience study. I'm not fully capable of answering how people do or do not do that. However, I think there's also a part of the mechanics that are happening here that also work to re-entrench some of these normative understandings around sexual exploration and sexual behaviors. So in particular, in You Must Be 18 or Older to Enter, the mechanics work to frame normative conceptualizations of acceptable sexuality. So the game does chart a linear and hierarchical path through various forms of pornography and implicitly suggests that technological advances accelerate sexual exploration to the extent that even simple childhood curiosity can rapidly escalate and become, quote unquote, too extreme, risky, or depraved. So at the beginning of this video game, you're presented with relatively, quote, vanilla search terms. But each new round of searches tends to lead you into more, quote, hardcore sex acts. In the final search of the game, you reach this level of the internet, the depths of the internet, bondage, hentai, scat, and furry. The on-screen text that serves as your inner monologue suggests that you feel uneasy, and this porn seems different. So there's this linear progression from vanilla to kinky search terms that I think evince a cultural assumption, A, that kinky sex is far riskier than non-kinky sex, makes assumptions about you, the player's boundaries, and draws on this long-standing socio-legal understanding of kink as dangerous. This is something that's reproduced in the law. And suggests, I think, that too much exploration is potentially risky. So while the video game otherwise takes a fairly neutral stance about sex and sexuality, types of sexual interests, it implicitly suggests that kinky sexuality is the exclusive realm of adulthood and ignores how kinky sexuality manifests in different ways throughout the lifespan, which again makes people uncomfortable to think about, but I would point folks towards Hughes and Hammock, who have interviewed adult kinky people who have narrativized the way they think they have thought about that sexual experience throughout their life. So, finally, I want to talk about this notion of the playful child. So the video games at hand use surveillance, I've argued, to put players in a liminal position. In play, through play, they embody both children and adults. And in this section, I'm going to focus on the political potentiality of this inherent in-betweenness, so existing, playing between adult and child, and the political potentiality of, or potential of using the child, the figure of the child, right, as a vehicle for adults' sexual exploration. So what happens when we embody the child? Both video games raise the question of the queer child in the sense of children who subvert the expectation that they are innocent, sexless, and on a linear path towards heteronormative sexual relations. For Catherine Bond Stockton, children are already always queer. So she writes, scratch a child and you will find a queer. To theorize the child's inherent capacity, so they have this inherent ability to question the taken for granted status of straight time and reprofuturism as the dominant rhythms of their sexual lives, Stockton coins the term growing sideways. So this is a concept, growing sideways, that she uses to, quote, prick, deflate, or just delay the vertical forward motion metaphor of growing up. Growing sideways suggests lateral movement, metaphorization, oscillations through time, and asynchronicities. Therefore, growing sideways is potentially transformative because it questions developmental models based on one's steady progress towards genital maturity and one's growing up to reproductive goals. The affective potency of you must be 18 or older to enter and how do you do it is related to their mobilization of the figure of the child in a way that adults can embody, as I've argued. As such, I think these games demonstrate that we can all grow sideways. And video games, as playful machines, are particularly generative instantiations of this desire to grow sideways that we all, I would argue, have, and the mechanisms of doing so. Stockton has also made this argument in a certain way. She's argued that if, in her paper or chapter, If Queer Children Were a Video Game, she explores this connection between growing sideways and video games. She explains that in video gaming, video gaming in its strangeness and virtuality approaches childishness and thus queerness. She's captivated by the childishness of games and how indulging in alluring virtualities allows players to grow sideways. She compares video gaming to candy, libidinal, captivating, repetitive, time-wasting, and, quote, grandly lateralizing of adults and children. In other words, video games can make queer children of us all. I want to take this slightly further, arguing that video games are machines assembled to fulfill our desire to become playful, to recapture the playful potentiality of being a child. We could get into assemblage theory if folks want to, but I'll skip that for now. So you must be 18 or older to enter, and how do you do it? Give players an opportunity for their childlike sexual play and experimentation. In doing so, they recreate a bit of the affective thrill and a sense of open potentiality that comes with adolescent and childhood sexual play. So again, here I'm drawing on threads of affect theory informed by Deleuze-Guattarian approaches, but also on Grosch's reading of the concept of becoming child as a form of deterritorialization that can disrupt the modes, quote, the modes of cohesion and the control of the adult. Munoz argues that our remembrances and their ritualized tellings have world-making possibilities. So what I want to argue here is that video game play about sexual discovery and exploration in You Must Be 18 or Older to Enter, and How Do You Do It, is one such ritualized telling of the past, of our past, that has the potential, some of our pasts, that has the potential to imagine new sexual possibilities moving forward. When we play these games, we are stepping out of linear or straight time, this like unerring forward momentum towards reproductive futurity. And we're looking at the past, to the child, to the figure of the child, but also our own embodied child of the past, to critique the present, I would say, and create new possible futures. As such, playing these two games might be considered a practice of queer world-making animated by productive, generative desire for reworking our relationships with surveillance, discipline, and control. And I think the video games offer us two generative ideas related to these concepts. First, by centering the child, the figure of the child, as a playful character, they remind us that play is an integral part of sexual development and sex more generally, something that can fall away as we become adults. They also remind us that play is inherently risky, or inherently vulnerable, if not risky, and that this is part of its value. The focus on the child also emphasizes, following Passanen again, that playfulness can be productively defined as curiosity towards possible ways of being and acting out in the world, including in relation to sex and sexuality. And for a long time, in terms of like the overlap of games and sexuality studies, for a long time, theories of play and game studies have excluded sex and vice versa, so that sexuality has also not theorized play sufficiently. But the figure of the playful child in these two games, I think, brings it back, those two things back together in productive ways. Second, by inviting players to approach sex with this playful childishness, the video games allow their adult audiences to buck these strictures of heteronormative time, as I've suggested, and play in queer time. Because of the enormous surveillance apparatus focused on sexual lives generally, but young people's sexual expression and gender expression particularly, I think it's imperative to recognize this connection between sex and play and take seriously the way that play has political capacity, that play can intervene in power and politics and these normative constructions. While sexual play is often disciplined, the playful child reminds us that we can foster play as a form of becoming and queer futuring. So, surveillance and discipline, and increasingly data extraction and modes of positive consumerist control play a role in ushering us from sexual playfulness to propriety. At the same time, as Karenin and Van Male argue, unwillingness to interrogate this normative temporality renders us docile. But by focusing on playfulness and childishness, these two games allow us to resist this, however fleetingly. Passanen argues that while adult sexual play is often generic and tied to repeatable patterns, it also always holds the potential for variation, improvisation, and change. Playing these sexual video games, especially combined with a temporal queerness of playing as a child, can be a way of fostering that variation, improvisation, and change. The two games at hand foster, I think, a process of becoming and growing sideways that might represent a threat to normative sexual scripts and sexuality. Playing, personally, I am caught up in the rebellious enjoyment of skirting surveillance and discipline. As such, the game affords me a moment of queer temporality, a wrinkle in time by which I might gain some perspective on the normalizing power of safety and orient my desire toward making a future with less surveillance and more sexual freedom. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. I was like, is this going to work? Is it going to show the presenter view? Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and also thank you, Jean, for being here as well. It's always as you were saying, exciting to have another game scholar around. I feel like I've bounced a lot of random ideas off of Jean in the last few months, so it's been really helpful for me. But so today, I want to talk about shaping self and how video games can act as oppositional and also be a way of kind of accessing art in a more, I guess, abstract way. So I first kind of wanted to start off by talking about, well, literal shapes, right? How are we going to talk about literal shapes here? And so this is a screenshot from Anna Anthropy's Dysphoria. And so this game is very autobiographical. She mentions at the beginning that this is based off of my experiences. This is not universal. And so it's about her getting access to gender-affirming care. And so you start off, after you go through the menu, with this shape. Let's see if this works. And so you have to fit this shape through, this little kind of gap in the wall. And it's harder than it looks, right? You can see me struggling here. And then you eventually get it, and it says, I feel weird about my body. And while she's talking about this through a very personal, autobiographical way, I personally felt a connection to this. When I saw this kind of idea of this shape, having difficulty fitting through this gap in, I guess, a wall. So I felt especially as a trans person, I felt a connection to this. And so could be harder for some people. I mean, I watched a student just zip right through it, right? So for some people, it's easier. Apparently for me, it's hard. But I really like this, though, and especially for myself and in relation to transness and autism, because sometimes the way that you understand self is not the way that the world wants to shape you, right? And you see yourself and you see the shape of yourself differently than what you are supposed to be, the way you're supposed to function. And I really related to that. But also, it made me think of this artwork. I'm just going to start playing it in particular here. So this is Composition in Yellow, Black, and White by Marlo Moss. And for context, Marlo Moss was, I don't want to give them any anachronistic, labels, but they were someone who was very gender non-conforming. They wore suits, they had short hair. I'm using they, them pronouns again. I don't know if this is what they would have preferred, but they were, and they picked a, androgynous masculine skewed name. So they're someone who often is read through a trans lens, a queer lens, or a gender non-conforming lens. And I first saw this artwork at an exhibition called Queer British Art at Tate Britain. And so it had the normal, museum label. And then next to it, there was a label that a lot of the artworks had this, where it was someone usually in the queer community or maybe not, that would kind of write almost a little kind of personal statement about it. And this one had a label next to it by an art historian named Alex Pilcher, who said, "A line has no gender, neither does shape or color. Gender does not reside in a hairstyle, a name, or even a body." And I really liked this interpretation of this artwork. I don't believe this is what Marlo Moss intended with it, but I like it, and I feel like that perception of it had more meaning to me than, probably what it would have said otherwise in the art gallery. But also it, again, reminded me of this idea of a shape, right? Shapes don't have, a gender. Shapes don't, lines, colors, they don't have genders or identifiers, yet we always are policing shapes, colors, and assigning them, identifiers and making sure that they fit or they should fit. And if they don't fit, there's going to be trouble. And so this started making me think about how are we shaping ourselves, right? How are we reshaping ourselves in relation to artwork, right? This perception of it through this kind of trans lens, this idea that, lines, colors, shapes don't have gender, made me, rethink this artwork and give it more meaning. But that is not always, the case. We're not always allowed that. I like this quote by Legacy Russell, who says, "To exist within a binary system, one must assume that ourselves are unchangeable. that how we are read in the world must be chosen for us rather than for us to define or choose for ourselves. And that really reminds me of dysphoria, right? That beginning where you're that shape trying to fit through that space, right? You are not getting to choose the shape that you want to be, rather you're being forced to be a shape that cannot quite fit into the world the way that you want to. And so the body is key here, right? You are assumed to have a certain function, and that function is usually based off of, specific social, cultural, political, that is always temporal, kind of ways of thinking, and it's not stable, right? It changes throughout time. What a certain gender role is changes throughout time. What a disability is considered changes throughout time. So it's not stable, yet we're always kind of meant to fit that way somehow and function within that system. But what if we don't perform this way? What if we do not perform that assumed function? What if there's a refusal? How is this oppositional, right? And so keeping this in mind, I want to show you a brief clip here from Digital TV Dinner. So this is considered to be one of the first video digital artworks. It was made in 1978 by Jamie Faye Fenton, Raul Radzitsky, and Dick Ainsworth did sound, which is in some of them. I don't have the sound here. But they made this artwork by smashing their fists into a Bally Astrocade game console. And then they also would put the cartridge in, load the game, and then pop it out. And so we all know, we've all played, game systems before, that will kind of mess it up. So you can see that it disrupts the function of, the game console, and it kind of creates this artwork. But this was purposely done, right? It was a predictable but also unpredictable way of, playing around with this game console. They knew how the game console functioned, and they knew that by smashing it in a certain way and popping the game cartridge out and putting it back in and doing these things would kind of create these glitches, but they also didn't quite know what the patterns would be. Jamie Faye Fenton worked for the company, so she actually was quite familiar with the technology, so she knew that it would kind of, certain things would produce certain results, but they weren't 100% what those results would be. And so in this sense, this kind of creation of these glitched patterns is not, a random act of destruction. It's methodical. It's thought out, and, they're doing it purposely to, disrupt the function of the game console. And this artwork is interesting not only because it is, this, original video game glitch artwork, but also because Jamie Faye Fenton is a trans woman, and this artwork has a very special place in trans art histories. And the kind of idea of the glitch as this disruption, as this kind of difference, as disrupting the system, has become a very powerful thing in trans art. So, keeping that in mind, I wanted to, this talk today, I wanted to kind of start to ask questions about how do trans people and autistic people make sense of ourselves? How do we shape ourselves? How do we make meaning from the objects around us, from the artworks around us? And I feel like part of that is, being oppositional to the ways that we have been represented, right? Often it's misleading. There's a lot of misinformation, lots of stereotypes, and very, specific ways of, representing trans and or autistic people, because there's a very large crossover. And I feel like a glitch can act quite well as this oppositional practice, right? So glitch quite simply can be defined as, a failure to function. And so Ari Gass, who's written a very good article about trans, and glitch representation, talks about glitch as the shift. It's an action. There's an operation usually performed by a player of a game. And Legacy Russell, who also talks about this kind of more in a glitch feminism context, talks about calculated failure. So this idea that this action is a calculated failure or a refusal to perform an assumed function, kind of like, smashing your fist against a game console to see what kind of glitch patterns would happen, right? You're calculating a failure to happen. And so she also kind of implies that this action is like a movement, right? It's a movement towards change that can trigger an error, right? An error that might challenge systemic ways of thinking about measuring and categorizing and knowing people. And so, yeah, I think that this is very powerful again. And Ari Gass kind of talks about how this action also acts as an aesthetic abstraction that challenges normative ways of, being, functioning, performing, creating, and also just like thinking about what is and is not, meaningful representation. And this can be done to kind of, disrupt certain narratives, right? So a lot of autistic and trans narratives actually have a very clinical lean to them. A lot of trans narratives have that, like, I was like a redemption almost. All this, catastrophic stuff has happened to me, but I've come out the other side. And a lot of autism narratives have the like overcoming, or alternatively, they're like the secondary character, and someone else's progress is being measured through how they treat the autistic character, Rain Man, for example. Anyway, so these are the typical narratives that you see trans and autism people through. So this kind of like calculated failure or this action to move away from this can be disrupting it and abstracting this, right? Because representation, just because it is a trans person or an autistic person labeled in a film, artwork, TV show, whatever, doesn't mean that they are going to be a meaningful autistic and or trans object. And so I think that this kind of aesthetic abstraction plays into that as well. And so this is how I think that a glitch is a very good framework for this. Gass, on top of that, talks about how glitches surprise or baffle because they have yet to be explained, or they resist such explanations. And they're talking about this through a trans lens, but I think this is actually a little bit more interesting through an autism lens, specifically critical autism studies, which here I define as a line of studies that seeks to foreground narratives of autism to challenge this kind of overwhelming narrative of a lack or a deficit-focused construction. So again, like Rain Man or music or, all those fun shows, right? And so it kind of goes against, it's a way of, like glitching this, right? Autism is often extremely hard to explain. It's hard to pin down. The kind of common saying is if you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person, right? Yet there's this kind of like universal assumption about autistic people, and which kind of plays into diagnoses. If you do not fit a very particular shape, you are less likely to get diagnosed. So if you're not white, assigned male at birth, usually quite privileged, have like a hyperfixation on something like trains, or you're that kind of savant or a misunderstood genius that runs around shouting, "I am a surgeon," or something like that. Just example, But so this is if you don't fit that "I am a surgeon" shape, then you're less likely to be put into that function, right? To be diagnosed. So it kind of steps away from that and challenges this, and also kind of focuses on the complexities that come around with, people who might identify with certain, either transness or disability, autism, whatever. Because often these kind of narratives of, lack or deficit focused are used as justification to treat people in a certain way. There's a really good book called Authoring Autism by Melanie Yegoro, and she talks about how once I was diagnosed, my body was no longer my own. And so I feel like the idea of the glitch can be something that, it kind of talks about the complexities of things. It talks about difference, right? It's not a lack, it is a different way of functioning. And spaces might not be accounting for the differences in how people function, right? Including some of these, having this is actually really nice, right? Because it accounts for that. But this is not something that we're always awarded. Or even the font. I'm using Open Dyslexic, so it might be a little bit easier for some people to read. But this is not something that always is in spaces. So these kind of ways of functioning aren't always allocated for, right? So I think the idea of the glitch is a way to disrupt this normative way of shaping people or assuming how people are shaped and function in spaces, and also how they are represented. Right. So some of these questions that I have come out of this here are, how can we glitch art as trans and or autistic people? How do we make our bodies our own? And how do we shape our own bodies, representations, and stories of self? But also, how do we use video games to oppose some of these more harmful narratives? And I do think video games have a very special place here when we're talking about art. because they are something that can often be a little bit more accessible. You can stay at home, you can sit on your couch, you can pull out your phone and play a game. And while like museums might not be accessible for everybody because of, sensory issues, or, just they might not be able to actually physically go in, or, there's a lot of like social economic reasons why people might not be able to go into museums, but also the idea of looking and defining art beyond this kind of Western, canonical lens, and kind of expanding what we can consider art and what is not considered art. But also, it's kind of a way of abstracting your body and your presence, right? Video games are interactive. When Brendan Q talks about how when you play a game, you talk about how I died or I jumped, even though you're just sitting on your ass playing a game, right? You didn't do anything, but you kind of extend your body in that way, right? So there's that kind of interactive element. And this interactive element creates what, Jean was talking about, affect, right? And this kind of idea of effectively orienting yourself towards a game, building that relationship, and kind of thinking about how do my feelings, my emotions, my experiences shape this? What elements of this are significant to me? And of course, this is very individual, right? Your experiences, are going to form your feelings and how you make meaning in objects. So I feel like one of the most prevalent ways of seeing this is through fandom, right? Everyone has their passionate fandom, whether it's like sports fandom or, your favorite TV show, favorite video game, everyone kind of has their fandom that they participate in, right? But fandom can also be an oppositional practice. So Grant and Love have written a very interesting book about fandom methodology in art histories. And they define fandom as a self-directed tactic for creating, resisting, and/or negotiating, and I added renegotiating, structures of opposition through imagining an alternative, right? So I feel like this you could argue through a glitch perspective as an alternative function. So I am performing an alternative function to what is being assumed, or I can be an alternative shape to what is assumed about me. And I think that this is a way of making meaning by shaping the art around you, right? So I am shaping the art not because of an assumed function that I play, but rather because I am making meaning and shaping that from that meaning that I'm making, or my experiences are shaping this in a meaningful way. So this sense also could be a way of you glitching the original text, right? Kind of like the Marlo Moss artwork, where the original meaning of it is kind of being, disrupted a little bit. There's an original function of that text, but it's more meaningful, at least to me, through that kind of, shapes, lines, colors don't have a gender perspective. And I think this is really important. Jonathan A. Rose talks about, trans fan fiction or trans fiction. Specifically, for those of you who are interested, John Watson in Sherlock as a trans man in fan fiction. Anyway, we all need that drama again. And so they talk about how it's important to look beyond representation and rather look at how people are using these texts to make sense of themselves. And so I think that glitches are a way that we can look at how people shape and reshape, deconstruct and disrupt, and especially disorient these kind of normative, oppressive, and harmful notions of gender and ability that can heavily impact people. And Gass in particular notes that glitches point to norms, but also insist on difference. And so I kind of wanted to point to a few examples here. Some of them I think are like kind of a stronger glitch, and some of them I kind of question if there actually is a glitch at all. So I first wanted to talk very briefly about Celeste. And so Celeste is an indie game where you play as Madeline, the pink-haired one. Well, we both kind of pink-haired. One is more purple, anyway. As you try to climb the titular Mount Celeste. And so everyone's kind of going, oh, you can't do it, blah, 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 you should just give up. And she refuses. She's like, I have to climb this mountain. And so on your way, you run into this figure who is in the mirror. And the game refers to her as part of me. The fan community has started calling her Madeline, which I like better personally. And so she's basically a goth version of Madeline. She has kind of purple hair and darker clothes. And so when you first encounter her, she's in this mirror. And then she bursts through the mirror, which is quite the entrance. And I feel like Celeste is a really interesting piece of, artwork because of the meaning it has for the trans community. I came across a Reddit post where someone was asking, what are some of your favorite trans femme characters in video games? And someone said, Celeste, Madeline from Celeste. And then they talked about how Celeste was their favorite game. And someone commented underneath, trans people having Celeste listed as one of their favorite games is so goddamn predictable, it's funny. And, why is it predictable? Why is it funny? Why is Celeste such a, predictable game for trans people to connect to? And so trans fans of the game have constantly been reshaping self through this game and kind of perceiving self and making this have a meaningful, story towards their experiences as trans people. And it's easy to see why. Because here, for example, Battleline's entrance is a mirror, and in a lot of trans media, the mirror scene is a common trope, right? Where someone stands in front of the mirror and they look at their body through a very dysphoric kind of lens, and they feel bad about themselves. And then a lot of fans also did a very thorough visual analysis where they looked at things like the colors. Like there's a lot of pink, blue, and white throughout the game, which are the colors of the trans flag. Some of the music has lyrics that sound like they could be a trans flag. So it's these kind of things that fans were looking at, and these things were kind of helping them make meaning out of the artwork. But then, a few months after the game was released, they released some downloadable content, so like an extra chapter on top of what the final game was. And it's really hard, and I haven't beaten it yet. So this is, sorry, I apologize. This is the only one that isn't a screenshot from one of my playthroughs. I know, fake gamer, right? But so this is the final cut scene at the end of this chapter called Farewell. So you see Madeline sitting at her desk doing a video chat, and on her desk there's a trans flag and a gay flag, and then on her bedside table there's some pills. And so a lot of people saw this as, oh, this is confirmation, she is canonically trans. But then some people thought this wasn't good enough. And in this article, this person is like, oh, it's not great representation. And she says that Madeline should have actually basically turned to the camera and said, I'm trans. And I'm like, is that great representation? But eventually, Maddie Thorson, who was the director of the game, wrote a blog post that said, yes, Madeline is canonically trans, and she also came out as trans herself, which kind of makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because I feel like she might have been a little strong-armed into, coming out as trans, but I mean, I don't know. But then I wonder, is this a glitch, right? Is this a way of, a glitch becoming canon, or is it an attempt to fix a glitch, or would we consider this a glitch? And I would say no, actually. I think that the way that a lot of people perceived her as trans in the end was in relation to certain colors, to certain shapes, to certain objects. So she kind of was fitting almost a very normative function of trans, a very linear narrative, right? So a lot of trans stories have some sort of transition, or you're associated with certain colors, and your transition is to a very kind of binary, cis-normative way of looking. And I feel like the game kind of does that in a way. So I kind of do wonder, is that a glitch? And I think of Liz Ryerson's Problem Addict, who also uses glitches and is talking about trans experiences, but rather she's kind of talking about how she wants to create something beyond the narrow understanding of transness. And I do wonder if this doesn't challenge that narrow understanding of transness. But that isn't to say that this wasn't a very meaningful moment, and Madeline is a very meaningful trans object, and I think that it's great that she has been canonically called trans, but I just wonder if the label isn't what's meaningful, it is the people's experiences and how they're perceiving it in the game and how they're making that meaning, right? Because no magical number or head counts of trans characters is ever going to, fix transphobia in the world. And so I don't think that, this is a glitch. I think rather it's kind of fitting a function, fitting a certain categorization. But on the other hand, I think perhaps a more satisfying way to think about glitches is in the game Hades. So just a very brief, I know I'm going over time here, a very brief flyover of Hades is that you play as Zagreus, who is the son of Hades, as he attempts to escape the underworld to the surface to, find out a little bit more about who his mother was, and because he's found out that he has been lied to his whole life. It's a roguelike, so you start off in one spot and you go through a random generation of dungeons, and then if you die, you start right back at the beginning. And I could talk about accessibility and how it works really well in this game, but I don't have time for that. But one thing with this game is that you have an option to romance various characters. One of them is Thanatos here, the Death Incarnate. And the other two here, I'm just going to show briefly. You can see Megara and Dusa, who is the disembodied head of Medusa. And so a lot of people interpreted Thanatos as autistic, and I did. When I was playing the game, I went, oh, this guy's autistic. It was just a headcanon of mine, right? And then I decided to do some research into it, and I found like this big thread on Reddit, and someone was like, what about Thanatos from Hades? I found this person on Tumblr who actually summarized it extremely well. Because for me, actually, when I first started going, I'm headcanoning he was autistic, was his hair. There's one cut scene where I guess he used to have really long hair, and someone goes, oh, why did you cut it off? And he was like, oh, it was always in my face, and it was bothering me. I didn't like the sensation, so I cut it. And then there's another one where someone talks about the surface, and if he likes going on the surface, and he's like, no, the sensations bother me. I don't like the sun, I don't like that. So I'm like, oh, he's autistic, right? And so this person, it's tongue-in-cheek, but I do think this person actually kind of summarizes a lot of what I was thinking anyway. And then I like this other post here where someone refers to him as the grumpy death boyfriend with the tit out, which it's a beautiful way of referring to him. I mean, no notes. Look, yeah, that's it. There's no better way. That person wins, right? But I find this theme here particularly interesting, right? And I'm relating this to the boyfriend with the tit out. I didn't just put that for no reason. But this is if you choose to romance Thanatos. There's kind of a cut scene between him and Zagreus, and then afterwards, Zagreus says that he doesn't like how he's being so quiet, and he says, what's on your mind? And Thanatos replies by saying, a lot of things, you'll have to grow to like it, Zag. Or what I mean is, don't take my silence the wrong way, all right? And then he, in fact, has to go back to work. And what I think is really interesting about this scene in particular, well, there's a number of things, but when I was personally diagnosed with autism, and the psychologist was talking to me about alexithymia, he went, do you know what alexithymia is? And I'd never heard of this. This was a new word to me. I'd never heard of it in my life. And so, for context, alexithymia is the difficulty in identifying, attending to, and monitoring emotions. So basically having difficulty with emotional regulation, kind of having a more external, thinking style rather than internal. So you're focused on external objects rather than internal feelings. And about 50% of autistic people have high alexithymia. And so he was telling me how I have high alexithymia, and this was the first thing I thought of, which I thought actually was kind of fitting considering it's like the idea of being externally focused. And the first thing I did was think of an external object rather than myself, or my internal feelings. So I feel like that was kind of, when he's like, yeah, you do have it. It's pretty obvious to me. I'm like, it's obvious to me now too. But then I thought, am I stupid for thinking about a video game in this moment? And then I thought, no, because this is something that has emotional attachment, right? I had this headcanon. I had already been thinking about this headcanon. And it was a way for me to conceptualize, for me to shape, for me to make meaning from this word that he just told me that I'd never heard of in my life. And I can pronounce it fine now, but when he repeated it to me, I don't think I could have repeated it back, right? So, you can look at articles, you can look at, blog posts or whatever that explain alexithymia. But for me, it was the grumpy boyfriend with the tit out that was what helped me understand it, right? That helped me shape what it meant to me. And so, yeah, I think that this is why he can be this really important object. And I feel like, again, sorry, I don't want to go over time too much, but I kind of just want to briefly talk about silence here, because, don't take my silence the wrong way. And I think that's a really important line in this context, right? Because first of all, I'd like to say silence through, alexithymia, this kind of idea that is difficult to articulate your feelings. It isn't saying that he doesn't have them, but he just is having difficulty articulating them in this moment. Don't take my silence the wrong way. It doesn't mean that I'm not having feelings here. And the second way I want to look at silence is rhetorical silence, and how a lot of times autistic people are left out of rhetoric. Their experiences are left out of rhetoric. J. Logan Smilges defines silence as simply rhetorical absence. And so this is quite common, right? I mentioned Melanie Yegoro talking, my body was no longer my own. I no longer had that like rhetorical power over my body. Your narrative is often placed in someone else's hands. And so you're rhetorically absent. So you can think of, if we're looking at him through an autistic lens, the idea of silence kind of being that, rhetorical absence. But Smil just talks about how silence can also be powerful in the sense that it can leave room for people to build worlds. Which leads me to the third way that I think silence is important here, which is kind of oppositional silence. And that the lack of label allows for world building, and it allows for people to connect to this outside of a diagnostic or clinical lens. Not everyone is going to see him and identify him through this kind of autistic headcanon, or see this and agree with it. But I think that there's a power in that, right? There's a power in that he doesn't have that label, and some people will and some people won't. That his function isn't so defined, it's not clearly labeled, so that people can kind of glitch the original meaning of the text to fit and make meaning from their personal perspective. And I also think that he's oppositional from a lot of autistic narratives, right? He's an object of desire. When they say that he is the grumpy boyfriend with the tit out, they're commenting on his body and his option as, a romantic interest. A lot of time, autistic characters are asexual or not kind of, thought of as objects of desire. Also the character design, right? They're based off of, the kind of ideal nude Greek mythological like statues, and you could definitely see that in the character design. So there's also like an art historical context, and it draws on that lineage that a lot of us would even just be vaguely familiar with. And so I think that he's oppositional in that sense too. He's glitching the assumed, meaning of the text, and that you can be interpreting him that way, but also stereotypes and narratives if you kind of perceive him in that way. And so players are moving beyond the kind of expected autism narratives and seeing this in proximity to themselves, but it also is not a universal, everyone's going to see this that way. So it's kind of a glitch through a presence that is unexpected, because sometimes glitches surprise you, right? And it's a way of understanding yourself. As I said, you can give me a journal that explains alexithymia, you can give me a blog post, but the boyfriend with the tit out is the best solution. I was going to talk about strawberry cubes, but I won't now. But I kind of wanted to conclude, I feel like this is actually sometimes a better representation of, I would say autism, transness, anything, because it's just like disorienting, right? If you've ever played, actually I can play the game as it's just very, you don't know where to go, you're constantly going back on yourself, and it's very confusing. But it's glitchy, it's non-linear, it's unclear, there's not a clear set direction. Even the key controls that they tell you at the beginning are different than what they end up being in the game. And I feel like this is a really, good summation of glitches, that it's kind of presenting an alternative reading to the assumed norm. You're not going to necessarily know everything. You're not going to necessarily know every single path. You can watch me get lost and go back up the stairs here. But as our presence continues to be misunderstood and misinterpreted, we can see how glitches can be powerful. And I think that we should embrace it, embrace this kind of disruption, disorientation, and this chaos. Well, that's it from me. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like people, I think it's that kind of effective orientation I was talking about, where people will see something and it is like they have an emotional reaction or emotional connection to something. So yeah, because you see a lot of people, especially with avatars, where it's like, oh, this is like my avatar, whoever. I always name my avatar Gary. No matter what game I play, it's always Gary. So It's an homage to Gary Oak, because, Professor Oak might have forgotten his name, but I never will. So, yeah, I feel like people kind of feel that ownership because of that emotional connection, which also I feel like extends to the fandom communities, because you see people get very gatekeepy. Not all the time. I mean, like, I was saying to Rachel earlier, my comfort game is Elden Ring, which is a stupid comfort game to have, but it is. And I find that whenever I always use, like, if I am lost or something, I always will Google it. And I find that the online community for Elden Ring is actually really helpful. I mean, not always, but I would say most of the time it is. So, like, people have this kind of idea of ownership, and I think that if they have an emotional connection to something, they do sometimes want to have it shown in the best light, which is why I also think it goes into the realm of toxicity.
Yeah. I think it's partly about play and like what play invites us to do. So I think play always invites us to participate and to, again, play as possibilities for being in the world. There's something inherent there about taking ownership of a thing and making it your own and playing and remixing and glitching and like all that kind of stuff. But I think there's also like a materialist, like the production of video games is increasingly easy. So tools like Twitch, or not Twitch, but Twine, and tools like Bitsy and other Game Maker, other gaming tools are increasingly available to folks who want to make a game. And I think there's a real like zine-stir attitude towards making games increasingly.
It's like easier and easier
Yeah.
to like access this, like make your own game.
Yeah. And I think then because of that, the like narratives can get like more and more niche and like
Yeah.
be super personal in the same way that you could sit down and make a painting or a drawing. Like you can make a game that's deeply experiential.
And with platforms like Itch, too, people can circulate those games really quite widely with like a low barrier to entry. So yeah, I think that's part of it.
Yeah,
too.
really it like increases the access of
Yeah.
them, like Kyle talked about. Yeah. Thanks.
Mario Kart always Waluigi because of fashion reasons. Yeah, yeah. Right.
No, now I have to admit that my Mario Kart character has always been Princess Peach, which
Peach is my second choice.
Yeah, like really
Also for
not a
fashion
me thing.
reasons.
Yeah, not a me thing. But we've been talking about, I identify exceptionally strongly with Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher, who is like a hyper masculine dude. And I just like, anyway, we could talk about queering characters through identification and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, so I'm a big Geralt fan. I would point towards a lot of porn scholars who have done work on the fact that those, like, age verification just doesn't work. Like, practically, it's just not productive. Like, people have, since the dawn of time, I mean, that quote I gave you, people find ways around age verification blockers. It's just not effective policy. So there's been research on jurisdictions where it's come into place. It's just not effective policy. On the other, in addition to that, I think we have to ask what is going on. And what is going on is that conservative politicians across this country are increasingly using this figure of the child, of this like pure, innocent figure in need of protection to justify things like, I mean, what that law is about constraining space for sex and sexuality, but it's also that same figure that animates calls to end or to like not allow children in New Brunswick to use their pronouns in schools. Like that figure of the child is extremely potent in what it allows people who would like to see our sex and gender freedoms like constrain. So yeah, I'm deeply dubious of the effectiveness of the policy. It won't do what people want it to do. That's been shown through research. And I'm also deeply dubious of the underlying ideological underpinnings of it.
Yeah, I feel like empathy games, right?
Say more.
Yeah, I mean, like the idea of like an empathy game, right? Where, you're being put in someone else's shoes and that you should feel a certain way, but you can never tell people how to feel, right? And often a lot of these empathy games, I feel like Jean could probably speak better on, is like, it kind of almost like simplifies and makes like a little bit more palatable kind of trauma in a certain way. And yeah, I just wonder if like, some of these games, can you portray trauma in a meaningful way? I think Anna Anthropres talked about how often it kind of gets lost between, on the paper, this is what I'm going to write about versus, what you actually see in the game, because there's obviously constraints. And yeah, I just think that it can be a little bit difficult, and not everyone's going to read something the same way. Like I was playing, have you played Stray?
Not yet.
Okay, has anyone played Stray? No, a little bit, yeah. Because there's like, there's a whole plot line about grief in Stray. And like, I actually found it very like emotional, but it's like, everyone kind of knows it's that dumb cat game where you like can trip police officers and like knock things on people's heads, right? Which is fun, and I love that part of the game. But yeah, there was this kind of interesting part about grief. And so there is a trauma, and that kind of was an interesting part of it to me, but it kind of got lost. And so I think that sometimes trauma, you could try and portray it, but it might get lost, so people might not see it, or see, like, it might not be as obvious to some people. But then should it be, right?
So sort of thinking about how replaying trauma might help us reshape it or give it new meaning. Is that sort of what you're thinking?
Yeah, there are differences between having the opportunity to reshape trauma, but also I find that some games or content or media uses those elements, like say amplifying to get those things, but also causes damage or triggering effects.
I see. Yeah. So I don't have a great answer for you, I don't think, but what I would say is I've been thinking, what your question brings up for me is two games that I actually taught this year, which are the freshman year, which deals with sexual violence during someone's freshman year. Again, Nina Freeman, actually, same person who made How Do You Do It? And Depression Quest, which sort of provoked Gamergate too, in part. So both of which deal with that, I think, in really interesting ways mechanically by reducing the agency a player has as to make action in a game as a way to reduce, to sort of gamify in some ways trauma, and like how folks pick up that game and how they think about it in relation to their own experience can really range. But I think that's the way to think about it, is people bringing their individual experience to the game, and that has sort of a, again, it's all individual. You're getting my brain slowly leaving my head at this time of night, but I hope that's somewhat helpful. I'd point you towards those two games, I think.
Yeah, and final question. Have either of you played or know of Frambo and Little Misfortune? You both should check it out. Kyle, Frambo, more for you, and Little Misfortune for you. I think you both would like them.
I always love Game Rock, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
One's a little horrifying, but one's is horrifying, but in a more funny way. But
yeah, it's hard to say, because it's kind of like often is like what is legibly queer leaning, right?
Exactly.
So like you could play a game like, I don't know, even Elden Ring has some pretty gay moments in it, right? Would you ban that game, or would you only ban a game that's like, what is it called, Queers in Love at the End of the World, where it has nothing to do with like, it doesn't have someone talking about, oh, I'm gay, blah blah blah. Like it's part of the experience of the game. So I feel like it would be difficult, but I wouldn't be surprised if they try, honestly. This is the way things are going, but I feel like it's kind of that idea of legibility, right? Because that's why everyone has been focusing on trans women, because trans women they're easy to scapegoat when it comes to like the why won't you think of the children narrative, and kind of this false kind of women's rights notion. But yeah, it's kind of, I feel like it's legibility, and then how legible can it be?
And how would you suggest fighting against that kind of idea?
Okay, so I would say that if a government, like, because this is getting into like book banning, right? Which in the same sort of vein, which we're seeing in the States, right? In relation to the gender panic stuff. So it's not beyond the realm of imagination. But what I would say is I think it's hard to do that in the same way it is to ban books, right? Because books are at the school's library, and that's under certain jurisdictions, and so they can take them out of schools. I think it wouldn't my sense is it wouldn't happen that way. What could happen is, again, around the internet regulation kind of stuff, where always with these laws, a lot of stuff gets swept up into it that isn't originally included. So age verification stuff, for example, if it's like, what is the definition of porn? What needs age verification? Does that therefore include itch, because itch includes pornographic games? So then is it that age verification is required on itch? Like, I don't know if that's even what is in the realm of possibility, but what I'm trying to get at is the thing that often happens is that there is a unexpected widening of the net to include things like sex ed, to include things like anything that talks about sex. So to give you an example, and again, the name of the platform is gonna immediately leave my head, but a video game distribution platform, as they basically were going public and were trying to get it, or not going public, but getting investors. And as part of that, they released this, like, our main clientele is young people 14 to 16, and they asked us to clean up, and now we're cleaning up. And they eliminated all pornographic games. But in doing that, they eliminated all games about sex. So actually, and like, who gets labeled as pornographic? Again, in Canadian law, what we see in cases like Little Sisters, right, is that who gets captured in that is like bell hooks eating the other gets pulled out by the border agents, right? This is, again, the case. So that case showed that the way in which queer stuff, specifically queer feminist stuff, was being pulled out. So similarly with this game platform, when they put in place that ban, it captured a bunch of non-pornographic queer material and a bunch of stuff about like sexual violence. So like a queer game about, it's called Curtains. It's a sort of one of these more famous indie games, and it's about the experience of sexual violence or like abuse, like coercive relationships. And so it got pulled off, but it's not porn. But again, what does that mean? Like there's like this, like the clause of the law and how people deal with that. We could look to Sesta Fosta as well in the States, right? Which has shut down spaces for sexual expression across the internet globally. I could talk more about that, but I won't go on that route. Yeah. Does that sort of get at what you're